In this lesson, we're going to learn some more Greek words, some more vocabulary, and this time focused on the activities of teaching and learning. If we focus first on the teacher's end of the learning activity, the main verb here to remember is didasko. And I think we can recognize here English terms like didactic. But didasko just means I teach or I instruct. There are some changes to remember in the first aorist and the first aorist passive, but they're fairly regular. So the first aorist form is edidaxa, and all that's happening there is the sigma kappa, when it runs up against the sigma tense marker of the first aorist, both of those consonants at the end of the stem and the sigma collapse together to form a xi. So instead of edidasksa, we get edidaxa. And I think when you even try to pronounce edidasksa, you can hear why it collapsed to become the xi. The first aorist passive, again, you have some change at the end of the verb stem, but again, it's fairly predictable. The kappa class consonant at the end of the stem is softened when it runs up against the theta and becomes the kappa class fricative, so it's the he. Now again, the sigma before that kappa also drops off. So it's not edidaskthane, because that's extremely hard to pronounce, the combination of a sigma and a he. So it's just edidachthane. And you can really see, by the way, how much these changes in consonants and things, the ones that are predictable and minor, how much these are governed by just people's ease of pronunciation. The noun for a teacher or instructor is ho didaskalos. And again, you can see the didask stem in there with a suffix on it that is one of the ways Greek can turn a verb stem into a noun stem. The didaskalos is also sometimes just called hakurios, master, particularly by the student. The student usually wouldn't refer to the teacher as hodidaskalos. The student would refer to the teacher as hakuriosmu. Or, in Hebrew-speaking contexts, sometimes we find in the New Testament the Hebrew term has just been transliterated into Greek letters, and we get rabbi. Now, in Hebrew, that just means the same thing as hakuriosmu. Rav is a term of respect that means great one or master, and the iota ending at the end is a suffix that means mine. So in Hebrew, rabbi just means my master. And incidentally, when we see the word rabbi or rabbi showing up in the New Testament, we should be careful not to assume that we're talking about the formal office of the rabbi, the way we're familiar with from maybe medieval Judaism and certainly from modern Judaism. There is no formal office, formal function addressed as rabbi in the first century. That office doesn't develop until, well, probably at least the beginning of the second century, and isn't widespread until somewhat after that. In the New Testament, this term, rabbi, is just a term of respect given to one's teacher or one's master, or anyone that you regard as worthy of great respect and regard. Another noun that has that same didask root here is he didaskalia. And now this isn't the teacher, this is the teaching. It's usually focused more on the act of teaching than the content that is taught, although it can be used for either one. So he didaskalia is the activity of teaching, first and foremost, and by extension it can be a lesson or a course of training. Another noun for teaching doesn't use that whole didask stem. Now the stem here has shortened to didach, and the noun is he didache. This again just means teaching, and it's largely synonymous with didaskalia, although it more often refers to the content of teaching. And actually, he didache in the Church Fathers, in the Apostolic Fathers, comes to be used very often for the content of Christian teaching, almost like the gospel, but with more emphasis on catechetical training of new converts. And there's a whole book among the Apostolic Fathers' works called he didache, which is short for the teaching of the 12 apostles. Another useful verb when we're thinking about teachers and teaching is sunago. This means I gather or assemble, or I come together. Usually that would be in the plural, we come together. And this is often used for the gathering of students to hear a teacher. The future is fairly predictable, even though there's a consonant change here. We have sunakso, because the gamma at the end of the sunag stem combined with the sigma makes a xi. And along the way we should notice that this is a prepositional prefix, sun, with or together, in front of the verb ago, and so the future form of the plain word ago, which means to lead or to think, regard, that future form of ago is the same. It's axo. So to get sun axo as the future of sunago, all we're doing is putting that sun prefix in front of the regular ago form. The second aorist of ago is quite irregular, and it's one of these verbs that you just have to remember. It's agagon. It's a second aorist. There's no sigma there, and we have stem change. So if we remember that the second aorist of ago is agagon, then it's not too difficult to remember that the second aorist of sunago is sunegagon. But when we get to the aorist passive, sunago and ago both become first aorist passives and become much more predictable. We don't use this agag or agag stem from the second aorist. We return just to the regular ag stem from ago. And you can see how we get this funny looking aorist passive eichthane by taking the stem ag, adding an epsilon on the beginning, and that epsilon combines with the alpha to make a long eta. So now we've got ag, and then we add the theta tense marker for the aorist passive, and in front of that theta, the gamma, which is a kappa class consonant. Remember our square of stops? That's going to soften to a he. So we've got a, just two letters again. So both letters of the stem ag are transformed just because of the letters that come on either side of them. But that gives us then the stem for the aorist passive eichth, which is where then when we put the connecting vowel and the ending on, we get eichthane. And similarly, the aorist passive of sunago is suneichthane. Akolutheo is another useful verb when we're talking about teachers and teaching. because this is a common term for the activity and the role of the student. The student wasn't understood just to come and gather information. Students were generally thought of as what we would call a disciple, as a follower of their master. And so akolutheo means I follow, and also metaphorically means I emulate, I imitate, which is what students or disciples were intended to do. The first aorist of akolutheo is fairly predictable for an epsilon contract verb. All we have to remember is that epsilon in front of the ending lengthens to an eta. So instead of ekoluthesa, we have ekoluthesa. And that's very standard for contract verbs. What we have to watch for here, though, is that because of the combination of the theta and the eta in front of the ending, it's very easy to mistake ekoluthesa for an aorist passive or even a future passive, because we're watching for that the or thes. Just keep in mind that this is one of the few cases in which another verb in a different tense can kind of masquerade for a moment as the aorist passive or future passive. But it should be fairly clear once you look at the ending, the sa ending, that doesn't match any of our aorist passive endings or our future passive endings. And so that should prompt you to say, oh, maybe that theta is part of the stem of the word. And sure enough, it's part of the stem akoluth or akoluthe. The verb akolutheo actually doesn't appear in the aorist passive at all in the New Testament. And so you don't have an aorist passive form to confuse you. And I'm not even sure how often akolutheo appears in the aorist passive at all in Greek literature. At least so far I haven't been able to find a case where it does. Let's shift to the other end of the learning process, the learner and the activity of learning. One of the basic things that should go on in the learner's mind is thinking. And although we've learned some words for thinking already, here's another one, logizomai. And I think you can see the echo of logizomai in words like logic and log, keeping a log of something. Logizomai means, at its most basic, calculating, doing mathematical operations. And by extension, it can mean I reckon. In other words, I go through a mental process and reason out this particular conclusion. Or I consider, as in, I consider someone to be good, or I consider someone to be bad. Logizomai can be used in that way too. Again, the other forms of logizomai are quite regular, as long as we remember that when you put a sigma in following the zeta there, the zeta is going to just drop out. And so instead of elogizamein, which again you can hear is difficult to pronounce, we have elogisamein as the first aorist middle, because of course logizomai is a deponent verb. And the aorist passive is elogisthein. Once again, the zeta changes in front of the theta because zeta theta is a difficult combination. Instead of dropping out, though, it becomes a sigma. So we have elogisthein for the first aorist passive. But the verb to learn is actually manthano. This takes a second aorist, which is emathon, and that second aorist stem is just math. And this is where we get terms like mathematics, or English terms like when we call someone a polymath, which isn't as current these days, but used to be a term for someone who had learned a whole lot of different subjects, different subject areas. So that was someone who was much learned, poly from polus, and math from emathon or manthano. A disciple or student, because that's really what disciple means, is just a student, a follower. The noun for that learner is homothetes, and you can see that that noun is based not on the present stem of manthano, but on the aorist stem, math. Homothetes. Now, homothetes is part of an irregular group of nouns, and the thing to remember with homothetes is that it's masculine, and so it uses the masculine article for all of its forms, but except for two places it uses first declension noun endings instead of what we might expect, the second or even third declension endings. Now, we're used to thinking of first declension nouns as feminine, so that's why this can throw us off. The nominative singular form is irregular. It doesn't really follow either the first or second or third declension pattern. But that's a signal to us that we're dealing with one of this class of nouns, masculine nouns with first declension endings. If we just look at the genitive singular, it will still seem like we're dealing with a regular second declension noun because we see that oo ending show up in the genitive singular. But suddenly in the dative singular, we see the regular first declension ending appearing. So the dative singular of homothetes would be to, the masculine article, to methete. The accusative is ton, masculine, methetein, the first declension ending. In the plural then we have hoi methetai, ton metheton, that should be tois methetais, and tas methetas. And the vocative plural is just methetai, the same as a regular first declension noun. Although in the singular, we don't see the vocative show up in the New Testament. We'll see other nouns of this class, and when we run into them, we can just refer to them as methetes type nouns. But again, the key to remember here is that you've got masculine articles and a masculine gender with mostly first declension endings. We have some other words that are useful when we're talking about knowing and teaching and learning that don't fit so neatly under the headings of the activity of teaching or the activity of learning. And one of them is he Sophia, wisdom. This is what most students thought of themselves as aiming for. Knowledge itself, gnosis, wasn't necessarily what people thought of as the most desirable goal. The most desirable goal of education was wisdom, he Sophia. And so he philosophia is the love of wisdom, and this is where we get our term philosophy. But Sophia was not just book knowledge, not just head knowledge, although that head knowledge was highly prized. Sophia was taken to encompass a whole way of life, where the head knowledge that you acquired was used practically and applied to every sphere of life so that you could lead a rational life. And this was what he philosophia was supposed to be, the love of wisdom, in which you learn wisdom, and in learning wisdom you learn how to live out that wise pattern of life from day to day. And that Sophia was not just supposed to be taught intellectually by a teacher was supposed to be modeled by the teacher. So again, the student or the disciple would not just learn by rote, but would follow akolutheo, that teacher, didaskalos. A slightly different word here, but a useful one nonetheless, is ta semeion, which means a sign, a signal, or a symbol. And if you've ever heard in linguistics maybe of the discipline of semiotics, that comes from this noun, ta semeion. And in English, semiotics is the study of how we as human beings use signs, symbols, to communicate. And so ta semeion, sign or signal or symbol, will come up in many contexts, not necessarily as theoretical as semiotics is in English, but even if we're just waving to somebody, that can be considered a semeion, a sign. A more easily graspable mode of communication is he parabole, which can be what we think of as a parable from the Gospels, but can also just be a saying or a proverb. And really, a parabole is any form of figurative language used to teach or communicate. This is Jesus' typical mode of teaching, and we often forget this because so much of the Gospels involves Jesus in arguments and debates. But those arguments and debates usually aren't initiated by Jesus. Jesus is responding to questions or accusations that other people have posed. When Jesus initiates teaching himself, he chooses this kind of metaphoric, figurative language. And it's interesting to reflect on the reasons for that. And that reflection comes up in places like Mark chapter 4. This was really the dominant oral form of storing and conveying knowledge. And that's why we have books like the Book of Proverbs. It's a collection of parabolai, of sayings using figurative language that were memorable and so could be used in an oral culture to store and pass knowledge on to the next generation. Now, Jewish culture, and Greek culture certainly, in the first century is no longer a primarily oral culture, but we still have a lot of the same tendencies, methods of teaching used that were used when writing was not really widely spread at all in these cultures. And even in the first century, we need to remember that the literacy rates could be anywhere from 20% to, at most, 40 or maybe 50%, some people argue, for some Jewish communities. But still, many people would be operating in a very oral environment where they don't read information, they hear information. And so the sorts of parables, sayings, proverbs that Jesus teaches with still make sense for that context where the majority of people listening to him need to be able to hear and then retain and remember that figurative, pithy, punchy story or saying. Finally, a few words about writing in books. The verb to write is grapho, I write. And the other forms of grapho are fairly easy to remember as long as we remember that phi, which is a P-class verb, when you combine it with sigma following, becomes a psi. So the first aorist, for example, of grapho is not agraphsa, but agrapsa. Now, this is a good example of how your first aorist active verbs can, on occasion, become second aorist passive verbs. So the first aorist active is agrapsa, but the passive is a second aorist passive because there's no theta there, and it's just agraphane. And probably the reason this is a second aorist without the theta is just that the combination of the phi followed by the theta was difficult to pronounce. The related noun, hegraphe, just means a writing or a book, although book could also maybe more often be expressed with the noun ta biblion. But hegraphe, as any piece of writing, could also be used for a complete book. And a graphe is made up of a lot of grammata, and tagramma is the noun for letter, a letter of the alphabet. The third declension stem here is grammat, and so you can see that for the nominative singular, the tau of the actual third declension stem has been dropped off, but it reappears in the genitive singular, which is grammatos. And from there on, this is a regular third declension noun. Interesting, though, to keep in mind that the plural, grammata, can actually mean a letter that someone sends. So in the singular, tagramma means a letter of the alphabet. But if you put a whole lot of those letters of the alphabet together, what you can get is tagrammata, which means a letter, a message that somebody has written down with letters and sent to someone else.